The smell of low tide woke me before my alarm did, and that should have told me something was wrong, because my alarm never loses to anything. By the time I walked outside with my coffee still steaming, there were 40 people on my private beach, coolers lined up, a bounce house staked into my grandfather's land, and an HOA president standing in the middle of it like she'd built the shoreline herself. She had a map proving the beach belonged to her association. I had a tide chart she never bothered to check. And in 4 hours, the ocean was about to settle the argument for both of us. If this is your kind of story, hit subscribe, drop a like, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from before we get into this one. Because what happened on my beach that morning is the reason I stopped trusting anyone who calls themselves a community leader. My name is Desmond Ochterberg, and the stretch of shoreline behind my house in Bremerton Cove isn't public access, isn't shared land, and isn't part of any homeowners association. It's mine, deeded to my grandfather in 1962 before the Cove Ridge Community Association existed, back when this part of the coast was just scrub pine and oyster beds nobody wanted. I'd lived there 11 years without a single dispute, mostly because I kept to myself and let the tide do the talking. That changed the week Priscilla Winthrop got elected HOA president. Priscilla wasn't subtle about her ambitions. She'd moved into Cove Ridge 18 months earlier from somewhere inland, and within a year, she'd turned a sleepy 30-house association into something closer to a small empire, complete with a newsletter, a logo, and rules about mailbox paint colors. She'd tried twice to get my property folded into the HOA's jurisdiction, both times rejected by the county once they pulled the original plat. I figured that was the end of it. I was wrong, because Priscilla didn't deal in endings, she dealt in workarounds. The first sign of trouble was a folding table, then a second, then a banner strung between two posts hammered directly into my sand, reading Cove Ridge Summer Kickoff in letters bright enough to see from the water. By the time I walked down with my coffee still steaming, there were close to 40 people on my beach, coolers lined up like dominoes, a bounce house anchored with stakes driven through what used to be my grandfather's crab traps buried under the sand. Priscilla stood in the middle of it all wearing a visor and an expression of total, sunlit ownership, like she'd built the shoreline herself. I told her calmly that this was private property. She told me just as calmly that the HOA had informally adopted the beach for community events 2 summers ago and that I'd never objected, which was a strange thing to say to a man who'd never been informed an adoption had taken place. When I pushed back, she pulled out a laminated map, her own creation, not county-issued, showing the beach inside Cove Ridge's boundary with a little red star where the bounce house now sat. I asked her where she got the map. She said a surveyor friend had drawn it up. I didn't recognize the name on it, but something about how quickly she produced it told me this hadn't started that morning. This had been planned. What I didn't know yet was that Priscilla's surveyor friend wasn't a surveyor at all, but her brother-in-law, a man named Garth Lindquist, who'd lost his real estate license 2 counties over for falsifying boundary documents on a lakefront deal gone bad. I wouldn't learn that until much later, but in hindsight, the map's confidence made a lot more sense once I knew who'd drawn it. I went inside to call the county, mostly to settle my own nerves, and that's when I noticed the tide charts pinned to my fridge, something I check obsessively, a habit from years of kayaking that cove. June was a king tide month, and that particular afternoon was forecasted for one of the highest pulls of the season, nearly 4 feet above the average high mark. Most people setting up a beach party would have checked that. Priscilla, for all her laminated confidence, clearly hadn't, because nothing about her setup suggested anyone was watching the water. By noon, the party had swelled. Music, a hired ice cream cart, kids weaving between adults holding plastic cups. I stood on my back deck and watched, debating whether to call the sheriff or just let nature handle what bureaucracy couldn't. Then I noticed something that made my stomach tighten in a different way.
A private boat anchored just offshore, far enough out that most people wouldn't think twice about it, but close enough that I recognized the hull design. It belonged to Roxanne Castellanos, a Marine patrol officer I'd known since high school, now working harbor enforcement for the county. She wasn't there for the party. She was there because somebody had filed an anonymous tip days earlier about unauthorized structures near a protected oyster bed. The same oyster bed buried under Priscilla's bounce house stakes.
I hadn't made that call. I genuinely don't know who did, though I have a guess, because Garth had a falling out with Priscilla's husband over money the year before, and a man like that doesn't mind watching someone else's plans collapse from a distance. The tide started its real climb around 2, faster than anyone not watching for it would expect. I watched from my deck as the water crept toward the cooler line, then the folding tables, then the base of the bounce house itself, the nylon walls beginning to list sideways as the stakes lost their grip in softening sand. Parents scrambled for towels and children, voices rising into the kind of panic that comes when comfort turns to chaos in under 10 minutes. Priscilla stood frozen near the bounce house, watching her summer kickoff dissolve into a logistics nightmare, still somehow trying to direct people toward higher ground, like she was the one in control. That's when Roxanne's boat moved in, lights flashing, her voice carrying clean across the water through a bullhorn, informing everyone present that they were standing in a restricted tidal zone with unpermitted structures anchored over a protected habitat. 2 Coast Guard auxiliary vessels followed minutes later, summoned not for the partygoers' safety, though that became a secondary concern fast, but because the original tip flagged potential environmental damage serious enough to warrant a federal look. Within 20 minutes, what had been a triumphant community gathering became a scene of soaked picnic blankets, a half-deflated bounce house dragged out by rope, and Priscilla standing knee-deep in salt water, holding her ruined laminated map like it might still mean something. The fallout took weeks to settle. The county fined the HOA directly for unauthorized construction on private land, and once investigators looked closer at Garth's survey, the falsified boundary lines came apart fast, exposing exactly how long this plan had been in motion. Priscilla resigned before the next board meeting, though not before insisting, in her final newsletter, that the whole incident had been a miscommunication about shared resources. Nobody contradicted her publicly. They didn't need to. The photographs of her bounce house floating sideways into the cove did that for them, circulating through Cove Ridge group chats for months afterward, a permanent reminder of the day she tried to claim a beach the ocean had never agreed to share.